Hello friends, today we will discuss Yersinia pestis and plague. So the point of our discussion for today's session, Yersinia pestis microbiology, history of plague, clinical manifestation or diseases of plague, and epidemiology of plague. Yersinia pestis is an important member of family Enterobacteriaceae. Important genus is Yersinia, and the most important pathogenic species is Yersinia pestis, which is responsible for the disease plague. This organism was identified in 1894 by Alexander Yersin. Yersinia pestis is gram-negative bacilli, which is typically a cocobacilli, and when stained with certain stains, they assume bipolar staining. That is a diagnostic characteristic. These organisms are capsulated and non-motile. Now we move on to the history part. There has been three important pandemics which has changed the history of the world and mankind. So plague is considered as one of the ancient scourge, and the first pandemic, which happened in AD 541, is also called as Justinian plague. There was something around 50 to 100 million deaths reported in historical book. The second pandemic, which occurred in AD 1347, which is also referred as Black Death. The mortality is huge in this pandemic, and it has been reported right from 25 to 200 million people. And this has been one of the worst pandemic which is considered till now, and has affected or devastated the European countries. The third pandemic, that is in 1894, which occurred in Hong Kong, also referred as Hong Kong plague, took lives of something around 10 to 12 million people. Remember, over here in 1894, Hong Kong, this was the pandemic during which the organism was identified by Alexander Yersin. Another important thing is that the death which was reported in China was something around 2 million, but it devastated India and took lives of something around 10 million people in India. The Black Death that devastated European countries, and which is very well depicted in art and literature of Europe. As for example, you can see over here in Pieter Bruegel's painting, The Triumph of Death, which depicts the horror of Black Death. Also in this picture you can see, and the narration which is over here also depicts the devastation which was caused by Black Death. They died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug, and I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. The Plague in Siena, an Italian chronicle. It is also vividly described in literature Decameron, which was written by Giovanni Boccaccio, which reads like that: kinsmen held aloof, brother was forsaken by brother, oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children to their fate, unattended, unvisited, as if they had been strangers. You can also find a very interesting picture. This is a picture of a plague doctor. The doctor in his protective clothing. The coat was made from heavy fabric or leather and was typically waxed. The unusual beak was filled with the herbs of perfume to avoid the foul odors associated with disease and supposedly prevent exposure and infection. The doctor avoided direct contact with patient by prodding them away with a rod he carried. And this was the clothing which was worn by healthcare workers during the Black Death pandemic. The clinical manifestation of plague. It is typically manifested as a bubonic plague, a pneumonic plague, or septicemic plague. The bubonic plague is manifested by enlarged lymph node, which is also called as a buboes. The pneumonic plague would affect the lungs, and septicemic plague is usually followed by the bubonic plague or pneumonic plague, which is represented by gangrene. So first we'll discuss the bubonic plague. Incubation time is 2 to 7 days, and initial feature is general like fever, headache, nausea, vomiting, and pain, but the typical feature would be the lymph node swelling, which would typically assumes enlarge and called as buboes. And it is found in groin and axilla. The groin is the most common one, when in children it may be axilla. There would be a pus, exudation, and bleeding later on. Typically, this would lead to a pneumonia or meningitis, and if not treated, it would be fatal in nature, and mortality would be something around 75% in untreated cases. The pneumonic plague is another feature which is seen in epidemic form. Incubation is 1 to 3 days. There are general signs and symptoms like fever, headache, and weakness. But the characteristic signs which are seen is pulmonary signs like cough, hemoptysis, dyspnea, and chest pain. This form of plague is highly infectious, as there would be a spread from person to person via aerosol. The mortality is very high, is almost 90% in untreated cases. The third is septicemic plague. The incubation is very short. It can be a primary or secondary. Incubation is something around 2 to 7 days. The primary septicemic plague is usually seen in accidental inoculation of organism, while secondary septicemic plague is usually follows either bubonic or septicemic plague. The typical manifestation would be hemorrhagic manifestations which are seen all over the body, and such feature would present all over the body, and that is why the septicemic plague was also known as Black Death. Epidemiology. The plague is a zoonotic disease. As we have discussed, it is caused by a gram-negative bacillus, Yersinia pestis. The vectors are a red flea, The scientific name is Xenopsiella chiopis. The reservoir are rodents, typically rat, and this bacteria is getting transmitted from flea to rat by the bite of rat flea. The disease cycle starts with a flea which drinks the blood from rat which carries the bacteria. So flea gets infected. The bacteria in a flea multiplies in a gut, and later on it will lead to a clogging of gut. So when such thing happens, the flea is considered or called as block flea. So when block flea again bites a human being, initially it would regurgitate the blood, and this regurgitation would contain the bacteria. So partially infected or partially blocked rat flea is responsible for the spread of the disease. So with the bite of infected flea, the human beings are getting infected. Now if we discuss the cycle of plague, there are two cycles which are running in a nature. One is sylvatic cycle and other is urban cycle. While sylvatic cycle, that is also a wild cycle, the plague bacilli are getting circulated among the rodents with direct contact, that is rare, but the most common is the flea. So biting of flea is responsible for spread of the disease and maintenance of Yersinia pestis in wild animal. There is another cycle that happens in endemic foci, in which the infective flea would be responsible for maintenance of Yersinia pestis among domestic rodents. Now human beings are getting infected either when they encroach the wild cycle and getting infected directly by the rodent or by bite of infective flea. Another way is human beings can infected from the domestic cycle by the bite of infective flea or occasionally by direct contact with the rodents. And there would be a spillover of this Yersinia pestis from sylvatic cycle to urban cycle in case of natural disaster. Now what happens once the human beings get infected? Initially it represents as bubonic plague, but it may be possible that bubonic plague may progress to secondary pneumonic plague, and when that happens, there would be a person to person spread via aerosol would happen, and this would lead to epidemic of pneumonic plague. As of now, you can see the global distribution of natural plague foci. India is one of the endemic foci, and typically the Maharashtra, Karnataka and some states in the north, that is Himachal Pradesh, they are having the natural foci or endemic foci of plague. Plague in India has been reported from some of the states, but the notable epidemic which happened in 1994 in Surat in Gujarat, there are reported something around 6,000 cases with 60 deaths. As we discussed earlier, the plague is endemic in some of the states, that includes Maharashtra, Karnataka, Himachal Pradesh and Uttaranchal. Thank you.